There is a wound you carry that no one else can see, a grief so private, so intimate, that you have learned to smile around it, to function despite it, to pretend it does not exist. And yet it shapes every choice you make, colors every relationship you enter, whispers in the architecture of your dreams. The Sufis knew something about this wound that modern psychology is only beginning to understand, that it is not an obstacle to transformation, but the very furnace in which transformation occurs. In the year 1244, in the city of Konya, a man named Jalaluddin Rumi, scholar, teacher, respected member of the religious establishment, encountered a wandering dervish named Shams of Tabriz. What transpired between them has been the subject of 8 centuries of speculation, but this much we know: Rumi was shattered. His comfortable world collapsed, his certainties dissolved. His grief became so profound that for months he could do nothing but turn in circles, arms outstretched, weeping and spinning, until the divine mercy burned through him like lightning through a hollow reed. From that devastation emerged the greatest mystical poetry the world has ever known. This is not a metaphor, this is not exaggeration. This is the alchemical process the Sufis call the path, tariqa. The deliberate transformation of suffering into sacred power, of wound into wisdom, of lead into gold. Carl Jung, working from an entirely different tradition 800 years later, circled the same truth. He called it individuation, the process by which trauma and neurosis are not transcended but integrated, not bypassed but transmuted. The psyche does not heal by forgetting its wounds, but by descending into them, by dialoguing with the shadow, by extracting from the darkness the gold that has always been hidden there. Tonight we walk this hidden journey, but be warned, the Sufi path is not for those seeking comfort. It is for those who have grown weary of their own avoidance, who sense that the very pain they have been running from contains the seed of their liberation. Before we descend further into this ancient alchemy, if what you have heard so far resonates with something you have felt but could not name, if you sense that your own pain may be carrying a message you have not yet deciphered, consider subscribing to this channel and joining this community of seekers who understand that the journey inward is the only journey that matters. And if this theme touches your own life, if you have known this transformation or witnessed it in someone you love, leave a comment below. Your story becomes part of the great work. Your words may be the mirror in which another soul recognizes itself. The Sufis speak of a station called fana, annihilation. Not the annihilation of existence, but the annihilation of the false self, the constructed identity that we mistake for who we are. In the Persian mystical tradition, this annihilation is not a singular event, but a spiral descent through progressively deeper layers of selfhood until you reach the bedrock of being, what Jung would call the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. But how does one approach this annihilation? The Western mind recoils from the very word. We are taught that the self is sacred, that identity is to be protected, that boundaries are to be maintained at all costs. And yet, we suffer. We suffer precisely because the ego we have constructed is too small to contain the vastness of what we truly are. It is a prison masquerading as a palace. The Sufi approach begins not with transcendence, but with descent. They call it the nafs, the ego self, and they map its terrain with surgical precision. There is nafs al-amara, the commanding self, enslaved to its appetites and fears. There is nafs al-lawama, the blaming self, awakened to its own corruption and paralyzed by guilt. And there are 5 more stations beyond, each a deeper stripping away, each a more complete death of who you thought you were. The question the Sufis pose is radical. What if your suffering is not a mistake, but a mercy? What if the depression that will not lift, the anxiety that shadows your days, the grief that you cannot metabolize, what if these are not punishments, but invitations? Invitations to die while you are still alive so that you might discover what remains when everything you cling to has been taken away. Listen to the story of Rabia al-Adawiyya, the woman saint of Basra who lived in the 8th century. She was born into slavery, orphaned as a child, sold and resold until she found herself in the hands of a master who worked her until her hands bled. One night, exhausted beyond endurance, she prayed. Not a prayer of petition, but a prayer of surrender so complete that the boundaries between self and divine dissolved. Her master, waking in the night, saw a luminous presence surrounding her and was so terrified by what he witnessed that he freed her immediately. But here is what matters. Rabia did not escape suffering through her realization. She chose poverty. She chose solitude. She chose to live in a way that would have appeared to any external observer as continued hardship. When asked why she did not marry, why she did not seek comfort, she replied with words that have echoed through the centuries. "My peace is in my aloneness. My beloved is with me always. I need nothing else." This is not masochism. This is not self-punishment. This is the alchemical understanding that Jung tried to articulate in his own language, that what we call neurosis, what we call suffering, is often the psyche's desperate attempt to force consciousness, to crack open the ego's defenses so that the self can finally emerge. The wound is not the enemy. The wound is the entry point. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the wounded healer, the figure who appears in mythology across every culture, the one who can heal others precisely because they have descended into their own darkness and returned with knowledge. Chiron, the centaur of Greek myth, who suffers an incurable wound yet becomes the teacher of heroes. The shaman who must undergo a dismemberment, a ritual death and rebirth, before they can guide others through the threshold between worlds. The Sufis understood this intimately. Their path is designed to wound the ego so precisely, so skillfully, that the soul can finally breathe. There is a technical dimension to this transformation that must be understood. The Sufis developed practices: dhikr, the remembrance of the divine through repetitive invocation; muraqabah, the meditation of the heart; sama, the listening to music and poetry that cracks open the barriers of ordinary consciousness. These are not feel-good exercises. They are technologies of dissolution. When you repeat the name of God 10,000 times, something happens to the neural pathways that constitute your sense of separate self. The default mode network, the brain's mechanism for maintaining the narrative of I, begins to quiet. The boundaries that define where you end and the world begins start to blur. Modern neuroscience is only now catching up to what the Sufis knew experientially, that sustained practice can fundamentally alter the structure of consciousness itself. Jung understood this from a different angle. He spoke of active imagination, of dialoguing with the autonomous figures that arise from the unconscious. He spoke of the necessity of confronting the shadow, not as a one-time event, but as a continual practice of integration. And he spoke of the transcendent function, the psyche's innate drive toward wholeness, toward the reconciliation of opposites. What the Sufis call fana filah, annihilation in God, Jung might have called the death of the ego in service of the self. The language differs, but the territory is the same, a radical restructuring of identity through the deliberate embrace of what we have spent our entire lives avoiding. Consider the teaching of the maqamat and ahwal, stations and states. The stations are permanent attainments, irreversible transformations of consciousness achieved through discipline and grace. The states are temporary graces, fleeting moments of divine presence that come and go without warning. The Sufi path is structured around the understanding that suffering is the mechanism by which states become stations. You cannot stabilize a mystical experience through willpower alone. You cannot force enlightenment. But you can submit so completely to the process of dismantling, through grief, through loss, through the ego's relentless humiliation, that the ground of being shifts beneath you. What was once a peak experience becomes the new baseline. What was once a glimpse becomes a permanent vista. Jung observed the same pattern in his patients. The ones who healed most deeply were not those who escaped their neuroses, but those who descended into them with such courage and honesty that the symptom transformed into symbol, the compulsion into vocation, the wound into gift. He told the story of a patient whose debilitating anxiety, when fully explored, revealed itself to be the psyche's way of preventing her from living a life that was fundamentally inauthentic. The anxiety was not pathology, it was prophecy. When she finally listened to what it was trying to tell her, when she made the terrifying changes it demanded, the anxiety did not disappear. It transformed into a heightened sensitivity, a capacity for empathy and intuition that became the foundation of her life's work. There is a poem by Rumi that functions as a key to this entire mystery. It is called The Guest House. Rumi writes, "This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight." This is not positive thinking. This is not the spiritual bypass of pretending pain does not hurt. This is the alchemical reversal, the recognition that consciousness itself is the goal, and suffering is often the only force powerful enough to shatter the ego's protective mechanisms and force consciousness to expand. The Sufis say that God has 99 names, qualities of the divine that manifest in creation. Among them are Al-Kabid, the constrictor, and Al-Basit, the expander. Al-Jalil, the majestic, and Al-Jamil, the beautiful. Al-Khafid, the Abasa, and Al-Rafi, the exalter. The path requires that you experience all of them. You cannot know expansion without constriction. You cannot know exaltation without abasement. The mystic does not seek to experience only the pleasant names. The mystic seeks to become a mirror so polished that all the names are reflected equally, without preference, without resistance. This is what Jung meant by the integration of opposites, the union of conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, in the wholeness of the self. Now we must speak of something that both traditions address with great care, the necessity of guidance. The Sufi path is not walked alone. The relationship between Murshid, the guide, and Murid, the seeker, is sacred precisely because the journey through Fana is so treacherous. The ego does not surrender easily. It has 1,000 strategies for co-opting the spiritual path, for turning even the quest for annihilation into a subtle aggrandizement of self. The dark night of the soul that St. John of the Cross described, the encounter with what Jung called the shadow. These are territories where you can become lost, where psychosis and spiritual emergency are separated by the thinnest of membranes. The guide is the one who has walked the path and returned, who can distinguish between authentic dissolution and pathological dissociation, who can tell when the ego is genuinely dying and when it is merely staging its own death as a form of spiritual theater. Jung wrote extensively about the dangers of inflation, the state in which the ego identifies with archetypal content and believes itself to be more than human. He saw patients who, in the throes of a genuine encounter with the unconscious, began to believe they were the Messiah, the Avatar, the Chosen One. This is not enlightenment. This is the ego's desperate attempt to maintain control by claiming ownership of what is transpiring. The Sufi tradition guards against this with rigorous precision. The student is given practices designed not to inflate, but to deflate, not to empower the ego, but to reveal its transparency. There is a teaching attributed to the great master Abu Yazid Bastami. He said, "I spent 30 years seeking God. When I opened my eyes at the end, I discovered it was God who was seeking me." This is the reversal the path requires, the recognition that you are not the agent, but the instrument, not the seeker, but the sought. And this recognition can only come through a quality of surrender that the ego experiences as death. But let us be precise about what is dying. It is not your capacity for discernment, your intelligence, your ability to function in the world. What dies is identification, the belief that you are the story you have been telling yourself about who you are. The Sufis distinguish between Hakika and Sharia, between the inner reality and the outer law. The path does not negate the outer, it contextualizes it. You still pay your bills, still honor your commitments, still engage with the structures of ordinary life. But you do so from a different center. Where once there was a tightly wound knot of fear and desire, what Jung called the ego complex, there is now a spaciousness, a capacity to hold contradiction, to act without attachment to outcome. This is what the Bhagavad Gita calls karma yoga, the yoga of action without attachment to the fruits of action. It is what the Taoists call wu wei, effortless action. It is what happens when the self, rather than the ego, becomes the organizing principle of the psyche. Jung observed that his patients who achieved this transformation did not become passive or otherworldly. They became more effective, more present, more capable of authentic relationship. But the source of their action had shifted from compulsion to choice, from reaction to response. The neurotic energy that had been bound up in maintaining the ego's defenses was now available for creativity, for love, for genuine contribution to the world. There is a technology to this transformation that the Sufis mapped with extraordinary precision. They speak of the latifa, subtle centers in the body, corresponding to different qualities of consciousness. The heart center, Kolb, is the seat of spiritual perception. The spirit center, Ru, is the locus of divine inspiration. The secret center, Sir, is where the individual soul encounters the universal soul. These are not metaphors, and they are not merely symbolic. They are phenomenological descriptions of states of consciousness that can be cultivated through practice. When the Sufi engages in dhikr, rhythmic repetition of divine names, while focusing attention on a particular latifa, something happens. The locus of identity begins to shift from the head to the heart, from discursive thought to intuitive knowing. Jung described something parallel when he wrote about the descent from the head to the heart, the shift from thinking function to feeling function, from logos to eros. He saw that many of his patients were imprisoned in their intellects, using rationalization as a defense against feeling, against the body, against the irrational wisdom of the unconscious. The cure was not more thinking, but a descent into the realm of image, symbol, and felt sense. This is why Jung insisted on the primacy of active imagination, the practice of allowing images to arise from the unconscious and engaging with them not as objects of analysis, but as autonomous beings with their own intelligence. This is remarkably similar to the Sufi practice of muraqabah, the meditation in which one visualizes the master, the prophet, or the divine presence itself, and allows that image to become a doorway into states of consciousness that transcend the ordinary waking mind. Let us speak now of the phenomenon that both traditions recognize, but which modern secular psychology often pathologizes: the experience of the beloved. For Rumi, nearly every poem is an expression of love for Shams. But it is clear that Shams is not merely a person. He is the manifestation of the divine in human form, the threshold between the visible and invisible worlds. The grief Rumi experienced at Shams's disappearance was not neurotic attachment. It was the soul's recognition of its separation from its source and its desperate longing for reunion. Jung called this the anima or animus, the contrasexual archetype, the inner figure who represents the soul's connection to the depths of the unconscious. When we fall in love, we are often encountering our own anima or animus projected onto another person. The intensity of romantic love is so overwhelming precisely because it is not merely personal. It is the self calling to itself across the abyss of separation. The Sufi path uses this recognition consciously. The love the disciple feels for the master or for the divine is cultivated and intensified until it becomes a fire that burns away all else. This is not regression or emotional dependency. This is alchemy. The lead of personal attachment is transmuted into the gold of divine love through the sustained heat of longing. Jung saw the same process in what he called the transference in psychotherapy, the powerful feelings that arise between patient and therapist. When handled skillfully, these feelings become the vehicle for transformation. The patient projects their unlived life, their anima or animus, their shadow onto the therapist, and in the crucible of that relationship, those projections are gradually withdrawn and integrated. What begins as dependency becomes autonomy. What begins as projection becomes self-knowledge. There is a stage in the Sufi journey called hal, state, that is both gift and ordeal. These are the moments when the veil lifts, when ordinary consciousness, is flooded with a presence so vast, so loving, so utterly beyond conceptual understanding that the personality structure simply cannot contain it. The Sufis describe weeping uncontrollably for days, losing the capacity for speech, falling into ecstasies that appear to the outside observer as madness. And perhaps it is a kind of madness, but it is a sacred madness, a necessary shattering that allows the old form to die so a new form can emerge. Jung encountered this repeatedly in his practice and in his own life. His descent into the unconscious between 1913 and 1917, which he recorded in the Red Book, was a sustained state of psychological crisis. He saw visions, heard voices, engaged in dialogues with figures who seemed utterly real and yet were clearly emerging from some layer of psyche beyond the personal ego. He wrote, "My science was the only way I had of extricating myself from that chaos. Otherwise, the material would have trapped me in its thicket, strangled me like jungle creepers. I took great care to try to understand every single image, every item of my psychic inventory." This is the key distinction. The mystic who is guided, who has practices and a framework for understanding what is happening, can navigate these states and integrate them. The mystic who is unguided can become lost, can mistake the contents of the unconscious for external reality, can inflate into grandiosity or deflate into despair. The Sufi tradition is ruthlessly honest about this danger. They tell stories of seekers who achieved great states but then fell because they claimed ownership of those states, because they believed the experience made them special. The master's role is to continually puncture that inflation, to remind the student that all states pass, that attainment is not possession, that the moment you grasp at spiritual experience, you have already lost it. Now we come to the paradox at the heart of both traditions, the recognition that there is nowhere to go and nothing to achieve because you are already what you seek. The Sufis call this hakika, reality, the truth that God is not separate from creation, that the seeker and the sought are one. Rumi writes, "I have put duality away. I have seen that the two worlds are one. One I seek, one I know, one I see, one I call." This is not pantheism in the simplistic sense. This is the recognition that consciousness is singular, that what you call I is not a separate fragment, but a localized expression of the totality. Jung arrived at something parallel through his concept of the collective unconscious and the self. He saw that at the deepest level, the psyche is not individual. The archetypes, the fundamental patterns that structure human experience, are universal. The self, the organizing center of the total personality, is both intimately personal and utterly transpersonal. It is the God image within, the imago Dei. When Jung spoke of individuation, he was not speaking of becoming unique. He was speaking of becoming whole, which paradoxically means recognizing that you are not a separate self, but a node in a vast web of being. The work, then, is not to acquire something you lack, but to remove the obscurations that prevent you from seeing what has always been true. The Sufis call this the polishing of the mirror. The mirror of the heart is always present, always reflecting the divine light, but it has been covered with the dust of heedlessness, distraction, attachment, and fear. The practices, the dhikr, the sama, the seclusion, the service to the master, are all designed to polish that mirror until it is so clear that the reflection and the reflected are indistinguishable. But how does suffering fit into this recognition? If we are already whole, if the divine is already present, why the pain? This is where both Jung and the Sufis refuse easy comfort. The wholeness is always present as potential, but actualization requires work. It requires that every layer of false identity be burned away. Jung wrote that neurosis is a form of suffering that has not yet found its meaning. When suffering is met with consciousness, when we ask not, "How do I escape this?" but "What is this trying to teach me?" it transforms into initiation. The Sufis say something similar, that every trial is a mercy in disguise, a divine invitation to let go of whatever you are clinging to that is smaller than the vastness of your true nature. This is why the path is called a path. It unfolds in time. It requires passage through territories of ego death, of grief, of not knowing. The mystics speak of barzakh, the liminal space between death and resurrection, between the loss of the old form and the emergence of the new. This is the space where most seekers falter, where the temptation to return to the familiar, even if the familiar is painful, becomes overwhelming. The guide, the practice, the community. These are what sustain the seeker through barzakh, through the dark night where all certainty has dissolved, but the new dawn has not yet broken. We have traveled far tonight through the hidden landscape where pain becomes power, where suffering is revealed as initiation, where the wound we carry transforms into the doorway to the sacred. The Sufis and Jung, working from vastly different cultural contexts and vocabularies, converged on the same essential truth, that the psyche possesses an innate drive toward wholeness, and that this drive will use whatever means necessary, including and especially suffering, to crack open the shell of the ego so that the self can finally emerge. This is not a philosophy to be believed. This is a map to be tested through direct experience. The question is not whether you agree with Rumi's poetry or Jung's psychology. The question is whether you are willing to bring consciousness to your own pain, to stop running from the very experiences that might be the doorways you have been seeking. There is a practice the Sufis teach that can serve as a beginning. It is simple but not easy. When suffering arises, grief, anxiety, loneliness, rage, instead of immediately trying to fix it, manage it, distract from it or analyze it, simply sit with it. Breathe into it. Ask it, "What are you? What have you come to teach me?" And listen. Not for words, but for the felt sense, the image, the intuition that arises when you stop resisting. This is active imagination. This is murakaba. This is the beginning of the alchemical process by which lead becomes gold. Rumi wrote, "Don't turn your head. Keep looking at the bandaged place. That's where the light enters you." And Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Both are saying the same thing. Your wound is not your weakness. It is your assignment. It is the specific form through which the universal light is trying to enter your particular life. So I leave you with this. What is the pain you have been avoiding? What is the suffering you have been running from, medicating, distracting yourself from, pretending does not exist? What if you stopped? What if you turned toward it with the curiosity of an alchemist approaching the prima materia, the raw substance that contains all potential? The Sufis promise that on the other side of that turning, on the other side of that descent, you will find not annihilation, but the indestructible core of your being, what they call the heart, what Jung called the self, what you might simply call home. And if this has touched something in you, if you sense that your own hidden journey is calling, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about your own experience of transformation through pain. Subscribe if you wish to continue walking this path together, because the great work is not done alone. It is done in community, in dialogue, in the shared recognition that we are all guest houses being emptied and filled, dismantled and rebuilt by forces far greater and far more loving than we have dared to imagine.